So we were talking about feedback loops, um, which probably seems rather esoteric, but I'll try to give you some examples. Um, Before Nixon went on his rampage against drugs and a way of federalizing crime, getting more power over local authorities, you had pretty much agreement on what's good and what was bad under common law. And in common law, power went from the bottom up, and under Napoleonic Code, power comes from the top down. And we had under Nixon and Mitchell a change in that attitude, and power started coming from the top down by decree rather than by consensus. Meanwhile, Europe was going the other way. Europe, for instance, has a policy now that all policy matters have to be supported by some sort of factual basis. It's called fact-based legislation, in fact. We have propaganda-based legislation or policy, and there's a big difference. But let's go back to the original days. There was a change of administration, and I had a client that was charged with a drug crime back in the 60s. And the policy was beginning to change then. And in a university town, it's critical because you have a lot of people from all over, particularly at University of Colorado, which was sort of a semi-Ivy League school with fairly well-to-do students from the East Coast mainly and from California. And they went out there to ski and play and various things like that. But academically, it was also pretty stiff, so you couldn't play too much. In any event, drugs came to colleges all over the country, along with long hair and anti-war protests, and a big shakeup in the whole social complex manner between generations and ideologies. I had this one client, he was from New York City. He was of Puerto Rican heritage, and he sort of stood out a little bit. Anyway, he was walking down the main street on the campus, what they called the Hill area, with a large, puffy grocery bag. The bag was full of something, but it looked fairly light, and he had no trouble carrying it. And a policeman walked up to him and started talking to him, asked him what was in the bag. Now, it was nighttime when this was occurring, and it was right near a local tavern that Robert Redfern used to work at called The Sink. And it was a hangout for local students. So Carlos was standing there with his grocery bag. I think it was Safeway, but it doesn't matter. And the policeman came up to him, asked what was in the bag. He said, "I'm picking up trash, man." And the policeman said, "Can I see it?" And he says, "No, man, I've got to put it in that truck over there. It's trash." So the policeman took a pen and poked it and saw something dribbling out. It looked like leaves. Grabbed the bag, searched him, determined it to be marijuana, and charged him with possession for sale of marijuana. And they just amended the statutes then, making it a very serious mandatory minimum of 5-year offense. They handcuffed him and sped him off to jail, released him on bond. And the district attorney, who ran on a platform of strict law and order, and essentially that was code to let's run the hippies out of town, decided to prosecute and make an example of this guy. Well, first off, you had various hearings. You had motions hearings, motion to dismiss, motion to produce evidence, motion for discovery, and most importantly, to challenge the search and seizure and the basis of the arrest, you had a motion to suppress evidence. And that motion was to determine whether or not the police legally seized evidence and is legally prosecuting. And if the search and seizure wasn't legal, the search and seizure became illegal, and the motion to suppress was granted. The evidence was suppressed. They could have their trial, but they couldn't introduce the evidence of any offense. So the practical result was dismissal of the case. So we had a suppression hearing, and the police officer said when he looked at the bag and shined the flashlight at the bag, he could see lean, green leafy material coming from the bag, sifting from the bag. And because of his training in narcotics, he realized that that was probably marijuana, which was illegal. And he seized the bag and opened it and looked at it, and it looked exactly like marijuana, and therefore he had probable cause to make an arrest and test for marijuana. And the roadside chemical test turned the chemical purple, which indicated prima facie marijuana, and therefore he was charged with possession of marijuana. And when the lab report came back, it was stated to be positive for marijuana. So, not wanting a 5-year sentence, and the DA standing firm on the idea of a mandatory sentence in order to make his constituents happy, went ahead and prosecuted. Now, right about that time, there was people coming in from all over. They were called flower children by a lot of people. They were rousted by the local citizenry, particularly the equivalent of the Klansmen. Going out of town, there were 2 billboards, one that said impeach Earl Warren, and the other one saying get the U.S. out of the red UN. So the town was very conservative back then. There was no alcohol served, just 3-2 beer. And the citizenry was ultra-conservative also. And one of the things they didn't like was anti-war protests, which they viewed to be unpatriotic, and long hair, which they associated with anti-Vietnam attitudes, and marijuana or other drugs associated with all of this, with young people in general who were not very respectful. They didn't respect the attitude of their parents, most of whom fought in World War II against a really bad evil, and they couldn't determine how evil the commies were in Vietnam, particularly when the evidence was that they were North Vietnamese rather than commies. But other than that, it was the normal generational dispute. In any event, they had this hearing for suppression of evidence, and the judge ruled that since there was green leafy material emanating from the bag, there was probable cause to grab the bag and make an arrest. Well, later we go to trial. And at the trial, the officer testified contrary to what he did at the suppression hearing, and said when he approached Mr. Rodriguez stood sideways to him and moved the sack from the side nearest him to his right side. He was facing left, hiding the bag from view. So I got into cross-examination and got him to say that he had seen green leafy substances coming from it. And that's what he used to get the evidence, the marijuana into evidence. But now at the trial, he wanted to change his story because what made him suspicious was the fact that Carlos Rodriguez was blocking his view with his body, so he couldn't see. Well, the officer's on the stand. He couldn't remember which version was true. And then I put my client on the witness stand. He testified he grew up in the slums of New York City, and there was trash all around him. And he said, everywhere I looked, there was trash here. There was trash there. And I vowed if I ever got out of the city, I would never tolerate trash anymore. And when I walked out in the street and saw this paper bag in the street, it just infuriated me. And I picked the bag up and was going to take it to a receptacle for waste when the officer stopped me. Well, he was cross-examined, and the prosecutor tried to break his story down about trash and things like that. Did a fairly decent job, I suppose. But then the prosecutor made an error. And he said to Mr. Rodriguez, he said, well, the officer said this, that, and the other. Are you implying the officer lied? With a very straight face, the defendant looked at the prosecutor and said, hey, man, you don't look like no George Washington to me, man. And that was the end of the questioning. Well, it's time for summation. That's where we organized our cases. He got up and said it was an open and shut case. There was marijuana in the bag. There wasn't any reason for him to have the bag of marijuana, and therefore he was in possession of the bag. There was no question that he was in possession because he tried to hide the fact that he had the bag, and by hiding the fact that he had the bag from the view of the policeman showed guilty intent, etc. So I get up and address the jury, and I said, okay, you heard the officer's testimony, and it's up to you. What's more important, to prosecute somebody from having marijuana or the integrity of the police? I said, in my community, where I grew up, integrity was everything. Your word was everything. The system worked because people could take their word or keep their word. I grew up in a small town, and you didn't break your word no matter what. And here we got somebody that wants to put a person in prison for 5 years because he has marijuana and he's Hispanic. And he wants it so bad that he's willing to lie. And I want you to take the flashlight that the prosecutor put into evidence to the jury room. And I want you to point it at each other and see if it's an X-ray flashlight that can see through you. If it's not an X-ray flashlight, and you got to remember that the witness officer said that the view of the sack was being blocked by Mr. Rodriguez's body, then you can conclude only one thing. And that is, the officer was no George Washington. He was obviously not being very truthful. He was ad-libbing in order to get a prosecution. And the prosecution was more important than justice. The conviction was more important than justice. And if this is the type of law enforcement we want in this community, go ahead and convict the defendant. Now, that was the type of argument that we were able to make under common law. It was the same type of argument that William Penn's defense attorney argued when William Penn and his followers, Quakers or Shakers, whatever they called them back then, were being prosecuted for blasphemy and various other offenses against the Church of England. You could comment because on our system you have 3 sections. You got the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. And the 3 are created to balance each other. Now, a lot of people favoring executive figure the court should just rubber stamp executive decisions and executive orders. That isn't what our founders had in mind, because they knew that you had legislators and they became professionals. You had administrators and they became professional, and they took great pride in administering efficiently to the point of maybe interfering with or denying justice. And justice isn't just conviction or putting somebody in jail. It's fairness overall and an overall view of what makes society work for all, not just for some. The courts, because of professionalization as things such as this, have got the attitude that they are the great power to determine what the law is and what the law should be, because the law is what the legislature says. And the jury's function is just to determine whether the facts are accurate, which is absolute bullshit. We should, if we had that kind of attitude, there would be no, black people would still be sitting in the back of the bus because jurors wouldn't have decided that isn't right. And various other things would happen because the juries didn't vary the harsh political views of legislators. So the jury came back in this case with a not guilty verdict. And it was curious because during that period of change, nobody was really analyzing or seeing how the law worked or if it worked. And you had politicalization, not to the extent you do today, but the prosecutors, people with the law and order mentality that Nixon had, construed the result of the jury trial as you couldn't convict people in Boulder, Colorado on a drug case, on a marijuana case, which was absolute bullshit too. It was deliberately, I think, misinterpreted. What really happened is the public was saying to the prosecutor, we don't like corruption. We don't like cops that lie. We want a system that works, a system that's fair, and putting somebody in prison for 5 years based on untruth or assumption isn't the way we want to run our system. But nobody thought of that. Nobody got the feedback. Nobody interpreted that. And that's one of the problems of having over specialization. It's like the adage, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the people that ran on law and order platforms got that view. They had to get the view, and as a result, our society and our legal and justice system started dichotomizing the same way as what happens in any war. We had war on a crime, and you had the one side versus the other side. And the crime in most people's minds were drugs. So drugs became the focal point of criminal enforcement, and everything looked like a nail. You had very little interaction between prosecutors and defense attorneys, and the defense attorneys were soon looked upon as the enemy. And like in any war, you have to have propaganda, and in any war, you have to divide things. All of a sudden, all criminals or hippies or whatever, or anybody that used drugs was in the view of the police a scumbag, and they publicly labeled people like that scumbags. And pretty soon, defense attorneys who represented scumbags became scumbags. Just in World War II, German soldiers became Krauts and other derogatory names. Japanese soldiers became nips, or worse, slaps, slants, slopes, etc. You demonize the other side. And we've had a society now since the Nixon administration and the drug war that has demonized anybody accused of crime. We now have assumption anybody accused of crime is guilty of a crime, therefore has to be punished. And this is a dangerous way to think of things because it violates the separation of powers. A real quick example is that of Oliver North. I'm not going to get into that. We'll do it at a later session, but Oliver North was the subject of an examination, of an investigation, and they wanted to prosecute him. They strung up landmines in a harbor. There was an undeclared war in Central America. There was weapons deals, etc. And Oliver North, who was a lieutenant colonel, was running a sort of an illegal war. It was a Contra affair. The big question for me is, how did a lieutenant colonel get the kind of power to fund and organize and promote a war without higher ups in the chain of command supervising him? And the public was led to believe he was the culprit. Well, I just don't believe that. I think it had to go up to Poindexter at least, or even higher. But rather than looking at how this happened or investigating how this happened, Congress got sidestepped. The congressional hearing then became about Oliver North and whether or not we should prosecute Oliver North. And they became prosecution minded. Whereas I believe that they should have said, we don't care about Oliver North and his criminality. We want to find out how the hell this happened so and make sure it doesn't happen again. So if I were in charge, I'd have immunized Oliver North and said, okay, whatever you did because you were stupid or disillusioned or whatever excuse you want to use. You were just following orders. We can even use the Nuremberg offense if you want to, or defense. But tell us how this happened. How did you gain this power? Who gave you the power? Who granted it to you? And how do we keep this from happening again? Because if we don't plug it up and figure out how to stop it, it is going to happen again. But all of a sudden, the media campaign, the propaganda campaign, turned against inquiry into how it happened and the function of congressional investigation to, can we prosecute Oliver North, or let's get Oliver North. And then the other side was able to martyr him, and justice or investigating facts or good government became a casualty of that dichotomy. Just like in my case involving the Puerto Rican from New York. It got into all kinds of things rather than, is this law fair, is it just, or is it a bad reaction to a situation? And for 50 years, various factions have tried to legalize marijuana. I've, from my point of view, seen marijuana legislation wreck a lot of bright lives. I've seen it tear our society apart and essentially put an end to critical thinking and other bad things, which is really too bad. And I think what we really need to do is start looking at our feedback loops and determining what we do. I thank you for watching, and I hope you were entertained and maybe enlightened. If so, please let me know. Have a good weekend.